It's 6 o'clock and it's time for us to start our ad hoc committee meeting on the $20 car tab fee. And we will start with roll call.
Deputy Mayor Wales.
Here.
Councilmember Baggett.
Here.
Councilmember DeCoursey.
Here.
Councilmember Pelosa.
Here.
Okay, and the next item is the consent agenda, which has to do with our minutes.
Second.
Okay, all in favor of the consent amendment, minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It passed. We're going to move right into the full spectrum issues regarding the $20 car tab fee, and we're going to turn it over to Shelley and Ingrid to give us a background presentation. Thank you very much.
Ingrid's going to start off, because she kind of wants to go over some ground that we've covered and maybe give additional detail, and then we'll get into the fun part, the money.
So, good evening. So after the last couple of meetings, I thought it might be good for us to back up a little bit, make sure that everybody is understanding the terms we're talking about and we're all on the same page with what the need actually is. So I wanted to bring a few slides and some information for you. Check and make sure that's on. Is it working? So the first thing I wanted to go over with you is the Pavement Condition Index, or PCI. We've used that term a lot, but what does it mean? So this is the ranking that we use to determine the condition of the street, which helps filter into when we want to actually go and do preservation work on a street, whether that's an overlay, a rebuild, patching, what it is. In previous council meetings and discussions, the question has come up about why do we spend money on the good streets first and not the bad streets. So I wanted to bring this chart so that you can kind of see why we do that. So if you're looking at the red line on the chart, what you see is that it's a whole lot cheaper for us to actually preserve the street up in this area of the curve. Once it gets past about this point, the fair point, its deterioration takes off fairly quickly in time. So when you're looking at what you're trying to do, you're trying to save the street before you get to a point where you have to rebuild it, and you can see the cost per square yard for a rebuild versus an overlay is fairly significantly different. So that is kind of the whole goal behind a preservation program, is trying to preserve as much as we can up in that good area to fair, while dealing with the ones that are falling to the poor and very poor on a case-by-case basis. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. So, wanted to also give you an example of what some of those look like. So the picture that's on there, that is a fair street that is actually at a PCI of, I believe, 70. So it's in fairly good condition. This happens to be Auburn Way North, or Auburn Way South, just south of Main Street. This is an example of a street that is at an 11 on the PCI scale and has failed and needs to be rebuilt. So back in December with the Transportation Benefit District, we talked about the funding needs for transportation. And at that time, we told the council, or the Transportation Benefit District Board, that we have $2 million a year to fund our local street system. That $2 million per year is enough, and because it started so many years ago, we are actually on track to hit an average PCI of 70 and be able to maintain an average PCI of 70 for the local street system. So the deficit we're really talking about is only related to our arterials and our collectors. And one of the things that I gave you up there before the meeting is some term sheets to explain what those arterials and collectors are. So these are not our residential streets to the homes. These are our major arterials. These are our major roads that serve our businesses, that connect neighborhoods, and that connect to the freeway systems. We have about 100 miles of arterials and collectors. Of that, our PCI right now is at an average of 55. Our goal is to get to 70, so that's a pretty significant increase. And I've given you a little chart on there that shows you the current conditions based upon the centerline miles. So centerline miles is where you're measuring the length of the street along the center line of the street, regardless of how wide the street is. I've also given you the comparison up there of what the lane miles are for each of those. So lane miles are basically where we measure the actual length of the lanes on the street. So if it's a 4-lane road, a mile long, it would be 4 miles of lane miles. So that gives you an idea of kind of where we're at. You can see from that chart that about 57% of the arterial and collector roads need some level of preservation. That doesn't mean that they all need to be rebuilt, but they need patching, they need overlay, and some of them do need rebuilding. If we were to go out today and do every single one of those roads to get to an average PCI of 70, it would cost us a little under $92 million. And I've also given you an example of what it costs to do 1 lane mile of street for either an overlay or for a rebuild. So you can see there's a pretty significant cost difference when you go from overlay to rebuild. Any questions on that? That's a lot of information, so.
So Ingrid, in looking at that analysis and the $92 million, so to raise our level up to the 70 from the 57 and to sustain that, what time period are we looking at before we either stay at or go below the 57 within what you're presenting now? So in other words, that 92 million is spent over what period of time?
Yeah, and so that 92 million would be if we spent it all today in today's dollars. Obviously, if we do a program over time, it's going to cost more than that because you're going to have inflation. You're not going to get as much done with each year. So it's going to cost more than that over whatever period of time is chosen by the council to try to fund a program. You might remember bits and pieces of this slide from previously. I've revamped it a little bit.
Before we move on, I think Councilmember Pelosi has a question.
Back on the 11% PCI, can you turn, yeah. Would an overlay work on that?
No,
Is this a total rebuild?
that is a complete rebuild, yeah.
No patching?
So the problem with how badly that road is deteriorated is the subgrade needs to be redone in order to build the strength back in the pavement. If we ground and overlaid that, it would not last very long. And the goal here is to get to another 20-year life with what you're doing for that preservation.
But patching?
You'd be patching the entire road. So you'd be doing a rebuild.
Councilmember DeCoursey?
That's great. No, answer my question.
Okay. So Councilmember DeCoursey, you asked the question about how long would we want to do that. When we did this analysis, we assumed a 20-year period, and we looked at several different funding scenarios with that. Granted, this was based on the TBD, but for purposes of this discussion, it gives you a good example of what different funding levels can do over time. So at our current funding level, where our arterials and collectors are at a 55 PCI today, if we only fund at $2 million a year for the next 20 years, you can see that our PCI level actually drops to 49. So that's why I've said we're losing ground with our current funding scenario.
Losing road.
That too. When we added in the 800,000 to that baseline, so a total of 2.8 million, we went from a 55 over a 20-year period to a 53. So generally staying the same with where we're at today, but we're not making any gains to get to that goal of 70. Scenario 3 was looking at that $2 million baseline with $3.7 million added in new funding sources. You can see that that does quite a bit to get us closer to that 70 over a 20-year span. Yeah, and based on the TBD, that was based on the 0.2% sales tax. That's where the 3.7 came from. When we combined all of those funding sources, so the tabs, the 0.2% sales tax, and the baseline funding we currently have, you go from the 55 to 66 over a 20-year lifespan. And what we have when we add $5 million to the $2 million is we get to 70 over that 20-year lifespan. So that's where the $5 million came from, where that need for $5 million came from over that 20-year period, and that's $5 million annually needed over that 20-year period in order to get to that point. So that's quite a bit more than 92 million over 20 years.
So is it 5 million more than the 2 that we have?
Or a
Yes.
total of 5?
5 million more than the 2 that we have, so a total of 7 million. And I do have to point out that as you get into those higher numbers, the amount of work that goes along with that type of a program requires some resources for us to actually accomplish. So if you found one-time money, I know that we've talked about that quite a bit, for 1 year at 5 million,
Yeah.
we would not be able to get a full $5 million program done the next year because we wouldn't have the resources, and we can't bring in new resources without the sustained funding. So that's why you're looking at a $5 million program over a 20-year period with resources to support it, to make sure that we can actually perform and produce that additional project workload every year.
Well, I think it's the consensus of this group too, that we want to come up with a solution so that every year we're not sitting down and trying to come up with other sources, because it does decrease our ability to effectively plan and manage existing staff and projects. So I think that's the reason why we have this ad hoc, is to come back to the council with something that's sustainable and will solve the problem for a while. The plan we come up with might have some annual adjustments in it, but we want to solve this in a proactive way so we can do effective planning. Councilmember DeCoursey.
So Ingrid, in talking resources, of course, both staffing resources and other resources you would need, any idea or I guess right now what the staffing resources would look like? And also, what do you consider to be an appropriate time frame for ramping up to get to a point where we can adequately manage those projects?
Good questions. When we did this scenarios, we assumed about 4 FTEs needed in order to get to the full program. To ramp up, again, when we were looking at this, you were looking at introducing the 800,000 1 year and taking about 1.5 years before we went to a vote for the 0.2% sales tax. So you're looking at roughly a 2.5 year time period to get up to close to that $5 million amount. So I would see at least 2 to 3 year ramping up to get it done.
Okay, Councilmember Pelosa.
So, what about outside resources? You must have looked into that.
So that still assumes that, yes, we bring in outside resources, but for any projects that we do need project managers here to actually keep the projects on track. We need the inspection staff to handle the inspection in the field, and as much as there are consultant resources to do some of those things, I think that we better serve our citizens and our businesses when it's our staff out there that are concerned about the effects on them than the consultant resources.
But if we're looking at the scenario 5,
Mhm.
you say you'd have to hire 4 FTEs?
For the management and administration and inspection work, yes, that still does mean that we would have consultant resources for design work and other things that do make sense for doing the program, for sure. In order to get it done, get $5 million worth of roadway work done in 1 year, we would have to go to those resources, but I still need staff here to manage and keep it on track.
So, so I make this clear in my own mind. So scenario 5 equals 7 million. So we'd have to hire 4 FTEs plus a consultant
Or 2.
or
Or 3.
So we often hire consultants for doing our capital projects. Those are part of the capital project costs that happen. So, yeah, there's probably some combination of that.
yeah. Okay, understand, thanks.
So when you talk to us about us annually needing $7 million, does that $7 million include the 4 FTEs or the 4 FTEs above the 7 million?
No, that included it in there.
Okay.
The way that my project staff work is they're primarily funded by the project funds.
Okay, great. The next question that I have then, you're leading me to think that you need to build over time, not a lifetime, but maybe a year or 2, you would have to build up to the $7 million ability to staff-wise and have projects ready to use the $7 million. That maybe as we look at possible solutions here, we can look at a solution over the next 2 years that brings some things on board slowly so that we eventually get in maybe 2 years or 3 to the $7 million. And that would allow us to do the projects, hire the right staff, and build our own internal capacity?
Sure.
Because we do have the 7 million for this year.
With all the grant funds that we
Yes.
have and the deferred projects from last year, yes, you are doing about 7.5 million of preservation work this year on several streets.
Okay, great, great. Okay, I think that's something that we need to really note, that we might want to look at some ways to become a sustainable fund, but we don't need to do it like next month, or we can start building it on it maybe even next year and do it over a couple of years, which makes $7 million or $5 additional million a little easier to come by.
And I think there's also the question for the committee and council about how long is the PCI goal of 70 the goal that we are shooting for? How much money does the council actually want to spend on the preservation? These are all scenarios for where we can get to with the funds that might be available.
Okay.
It comes down to the policy question of what is your goal and what do you want to accomplish?
Well, my goal would be to have 90 level roads that we don't have to pay for. I'm only going with the
Get there.
70 because I'm going with the 70 because you recommended it. I'm going with the 7 million because you said that that's what we need by and large to sustain roads at a level of 70.
So two clarifications.
Yes.
The average PCI of 70 was actually set by council when we began the preservation programs back with the local street program. So that was a decision made by the council at that time, that they felt that having an average of 70 was an appropriate level for condition of street within the city. That means that you're going to have some roads that are at 70, some roads that are at 90, some roads that are at 10. You're going to have all that combination. It just means that primarily they're erring towards the good side of the spectrum.
Councilmember DeCoursey.
And I think as I mentioned last meeting, my preference would be to use the term passable.
Okay.
To make sure that the roads are in good enough condition where you don't have people meandering around the deep potholes all the time and the other things that would deteriorate the road. But also looking at it from the time frame of having to go back and do it again, which you basically mentioned last time. I believe we get about 10 years of good road service when we do the overlays, and we've got to again look at where we're going beyond the 10-year period. So we're looking at a 20-year program here, and I guess my desire would be that it's maybe some minor work on the 10-year program, but not have to go back every 10 years and redo everything, because we would be in a never-ending process of overlay and/or rebuilding, because we could never get caught up at that point in time.
Right.
So I would like to look at it as whatever we can determine that level to be, and what I would consider to be passable, that would get us the maximum amount of time frame we could get. And I have to use the term for the least amount of money.
And I would also want to point out that the 20-year time frame that we used for doing the scenarios was because in order to run the scenarios, we need a definitive time. So that doesn't mean that we're stuck at 20 years. It's how quickly do you want to get to that average of 70 versus how long do you want to take to get there?
Councilmember Baggett.
Thank you. Ingrid, you say we have 7 million this year, and we have enough people currently.
So these projects have been going on for several years already, and several of them are grant-funded projects. So they have been worked into the capital program. 2 of them, Auburn Way North Preservation and the B Street Northwest Rebuild, were both projects originally planned to be under construction last year. Auburn Way North got delayed to this year because of poor bids last year, and B Street Northwest got delayed to this year because of some of the utility work that we need to do with that. So.
But the point is, you still have adequate FTEs out there to do the job.
Yes, but we didn't do those designs in 1 year and get them built in 1 year.
That may be
We did it
true.
over about 3 years.
The reason I'm asking that is that I'm trying to justify in my own mind your 4 FTEs. How did you arrive at that number?
And again, that's an estimate. It's not a guarantee of what that would be, but what we wanted to do in putting these scenarios together was to make an assumption that there is some amount of FTEs in there in order to deliver a program like that. every year. So there's a difference between delivering 7 million every year where you start one year and deliver by the next summer because we have to hit the paving season versus having 3 years to get through design and the bidding process and the construction process.
But we have adequate staff right now, right?
For the projects that are on the current list, yes. But we're talking about adding an additional 5 million on top of that current list.
Of
That's
which
where the
there are
problem is.
4 FTEs in that 5 million, right?
Mhm.
Okay. The other thing is, you mentioned consultants. What do these consultants do?
The design work, survey,
So they're the design
yeah,
arm of
putting
that.
the package together for the rebuild type projects and the.
Well, a
more
lot of these
significant-
asphalt companies of notability, shall we say, or technical qualifications, they have design people that work for them. So why couldn't these people be pulled in to do that work as part of their
Public
project?
bid law,
Pardon?
public bid law. We have to bid the project designed. And then
Separately?
we have to design it and put it out on the street for bidding, already designed.
You can't do a design build?
Not for these smaller projects.
$5 million is not a small project per year.
In order to go to a design build process under state law for something like this, we have to go through a certification process and a review and approval process at the state level, and I believe the dollar figure is about 10 million that it needs to be.
Sounds to me like we need to really overhaul that system to allow us a little more flexibility in our bidding cycles. I don't know how we can do that, but I don't want to go up against the state or the federal side of things, but that's where some of our grant money comes from, and I think that we need to look at how much of that we're going to get every year as well.
And some of the grants that we get would not necessarily allow us to deliver a project that way as well.
Well, yeah, you can't bank on on those every year, but a certain amount of them you certainly might be able to allow.
I think
We're fishing.
Claude's over here, he's
Yeah,
he's
I think,
ready.
Bob, I think in looking at this has been a question for the state for years and years and years. You know, when they set their thresholds, in some respects, they're set unreasonably high. Design build especially is a very complex process when you're looking at bid laws in the state. And also, a few years ago, we went to a general contractor construction manager scenario, GCCM, where again you had to have a $10 million threshold in order to build. So the universities and other entities like that could hit those thresholds where agencies like I worked at housing authorities, there's no way we could do that because our maximum project out of my department was maybe $4 or $5 million until we had a couple of real big projects we were allowed to do the GCCM on. So
Well,
I think for us to go through the process as council members to work with our state legislatures again, which is going to be a long process, is something we should definitely look at because it ties the hands of the local jurisdictions when you're unable to do things, and the design process is expensive.
I understand a lot of that relative to building construction and things of that nature, but I would think that asphalt paving, roadways, things of that nature, those are pretty well established operations that I think that is not, I wouldn't put those in the same category as building universities or
I don't disagree with
housing
that, but
projects.
unfortunately, the state doesn't characterize that in a sense where they require a civil engineer and a stamp on the drawings to do all that, where some of the paving companies may not have that level of expertise within their organizations. They have people who serve as perhaps project managers, project engineers, but not necessarily a licensed civil engineer in order to produce and stamp drawings. And that's where the consultants come from, unfortunately, in that process.
Okay, thank you.
We haven't given you a chance to even get to slide 3, so
No.
we'll turn it back over to you. You can see that you're causing us to think of creative ways that don't always work.
No, that's all good conversation. The last slide that I had up there is just an excerpt from the State of Our Streets report that we had before. So you had asked previously about the time frame for what some of these treatments do, and that's what this chart explains a little bit better than me off the top of my head at the last meeting, so that you can see what does it mean when we do a rebuild. You're trying to get basically another 20-year life to that pavement versus an overlay where you might be doing anywhere from 15 to 20 years on that. And then the cost difference between those, which matches what's on the previous slides.
So when was the council's policy established for the 70 level of our streets?
I believe the SOS program started in 2004.
Yeah, back then, 4, 5.
And
Okay, I
it was
remember that.
part of that, beginning that whole program was setting an average PCI of 70.
And do you feel, 13 years later, that's a good goal for us still?
So, fair on this chart is a PCI of 70, to give you an idea. So after 70 is where you start to lose the road fairly quickly.
Okay.
So an average PCI of 70 means, again, the majority of your streets are in that fair to good. You still have some that are down in the poor and the very poor, but the majority of the streets are in the good area.
Thank you. Any more questions before we move to the next? I appreciate that. Each time I hear and understand more. Thank you.
And this was arterial streets. So these are, what Ingrid was talking about were the arterial streets, and those are the center line miles of the arterials, but there's local streets also. And that's, as you know, the SOS program.
And that 2 million that we have for SOS is adequate?
So where we're at right now on the overall average PCI for our local streets is, I believe, 69.
Okay.
So we're pretty close to hitting 70, and I believe that funding it again, continuing it at 2 million a year, we're going to be able to maintain that 70.
Councilmember Pelosi.
So I'd like to ask about this.
Shelley, do you want us to ask about some of these documents, or do you have a presentation for us also?
Well, I have 2 things here for you this evening. I have the memorandum with the graphs that I've attached, which are REIT funding and how we've used the REIT as this committee requested.
Okay.
And we can go through that. And then I also, going over the minutes, Councilmember Pelosi requested a listing of the capital projects that we have in the 2017-2018 budget. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time utilizing our budget to show you where to look to see those lists rather than creating additional lists. We have them here, and we can look at our documents and get there.
I have a quick question
Sure.
before you get into your large presentation. In our packet, the flow chart that we have for REIT 1 and REIT 2 was dated 4/25. And the spreadsheet that you gave us tonight is dated 5/1.
Yes.
So I did my homework over the weekend, and I marked up the 4/25 chart. Are there any differences?
There is. There's 2 differences.
Okay.
And this is staff throwing things together very quickly from our Monday night meeting and meeting the clerk's
So if you
deadline.
could tell
I
us.
will. If we look at, up under REIT 1, as you remember in my first email that I sent you last week, I talked about a number of 759,000 under 2016 actual is the second item. Under 2016, there's 657,826, and below that 759,219. And underneath that's 202,000 and 425,000. Those items should all be down, added together, and under the Community and Youth Teen Center. And that would bring that up to this one that's dated 5/1, moving those numbers down, just under 1.4 million of REIT 1.
I'm not with you.
Okay.
You lost me too.
Okay. Your sheet dated 4/25 or 4/28?
4/25.
Okay. The sheet dated 4/25, under the actual 2016 column.
That was what added
And we're talking about this big spreadsheet, correct? Okay. Do you see the number $657,826? Do you see the three numbers underneath that? Those should all be moved down to the Community and Youth Teen Center project. All three of those numbers. And they have moved down on the 5-1 spreadsheet.
So that's the 1.3 million?
Right.
Okay.
That's been moved down. The numbers didn't change, it's classification.
Is that the only change?
That's the only change.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Sharon.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I laid this out, I drilled down, of course, this big spreadsheet being the most detail, but the first charts on page, I don't know what page of the packet, but of my memorandum, page 2 of my memorandum in the center, we requested that we go back to 2012 and show you how we've utilized REIT 1 and REIT 2 funding. And it's been categorized into a couple of different areas because that's where it's generally used. We have debt service, streets, buildings, parks, and some other. And REIT 1, you can see the largest use of REIT 1 since 2012 is for debt service. And again, this is the debt service, the general government portion of the debt service on the annex building. And that's a 30-year bond, and we are in year 7, that bond.
Councilmember Pelosi.
So the debt service of 4.6 million, is that a stretch amount, or is that per the bank? Is that per the bank amount, or is that per our amount? Can we do anything lower than that?
No,
Okay.
that is a fixed debt service payment.
Okay, thank you.
And REIT 1 funds, we have not utilized for streets. We generally go to REIT 2 for streets first because REIT 2 is more restricted than REIT 1. And we save the REIT 1 for the buildings because we can do buildings with REIT 1, whereas we cannot do facilities with REIT 2. And then parks,
Yeah. Councilmember Pelosi.
So, under buildings, 2.9 million, what were the tasks involved there?
well, most of that is the youth center, the community center. And the balance of that has been the city hall remodel, the council remodel, and then we have some structural repairs in 2017 and 2018 that we're going to do.
Can you tell us what the structural repairs are for 2017 and 2018?
The city hall roof replacement is a use of REIT 1, and it's budgeted in 2018, and it's $200,000.
Okay.
And the city hall exterior structural repairs is $250,000 in 2018. So remember, this graph goes through 2018 budget.
This is on the spreadsheet, right?
Yes, the detail. You asked.
Okay.
So those are the big ticket items. The city council.
I'm having some trouble.
The city hall, this council chamber and city hall remodel was $564,000. And then the two that are, and that was, that's been done since 2013. That's been also some of the legal department as well as this facility here. This whole city council chamber was at $500,000. That includes the legal remodel as well as this. And then the 250 for the structural, the bricks and the roof, 200,000. So that's the bulk of the buildings that you're seeing on Route 1 on that particular graph. And in parks, we have some property acquisition in 2017. We have some M&O vehicle bay maintenance, fuel tank replacement, things like that under the other.
What is the, what is the property acquisition?
That is adjacent to the Mary Olson Farm. It's the Watts property acquisition, and that's a match. There's another $125,000 that's coming from an outside source.
Councilmember Pelosi, please.
Can you be a little more detail on that property, please?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, above the Olson Farm, there's a residence that's listed for sale, and with that property is basically about 20 acres of the ravine that's above the farm, including the area where the Olson Creek actually deadheads. And so we're looking at acquiring that. The property actually is selling to another property owner right now, and so this acquisition may or may not happen. We received a grant from King County Conservation Futures for 50% of the amount, but we will have to negotiate with a new group and see if they're interested in selling basically the ravine area. So it's not a done deal by any means. I think that it's going to be around 200,000, 100,000 of city and 100,000 of outside funding.
So what is the purpose of the city acquiring that property?
A couple of things. Right above the farm, there's a fence that's on the property line, and a lot of the activities of salmon restoration, we have to stop right at the end of that line, not go on the private property, which we'd love to be able to go up the hill a little bit farther for education purposes. It's also where people met 100 years ago, and kind of it was part of the farm years and years ago. So we'd love to acquire it, and also there's a lot of forest restoration that we could do in there.
What about, have you gone to King Conservation District? Maybe they would be interested in helping us there?
Well, we went to King Conservation Futures, which are the acquisition folks, so that's where we got the initial match for the project before we had to stop going after the project as he sold to another private owner. But we would always look to Conservation District.
We're trying to find money to build roads.
Right.
So I think we ought to look at other areas for that 125,000 if that potential is still there.
That potential's still there. There's no offer sheet anymore.
So, and also Raya 9 might be a area that we could get some funding.
My concern, though, is we are notorious for finding great funding sources for purchasing things, but after we purchase it, we have to develop it, and we have to maintain it. And I know Mary Olson Farm is incredible on their use of volunteers for those educational programs, but there still are other things that we end up paying. Insurance and everything else, and I think that we need to, is this project going through the Parks Commission? I mean, this is the first I've heard of it.
No, this project's basically dead right now.
Okay.
And that
Okay.
the property owner that we were negotiating with is no longer going to be the property owner.
Okay, and so if it weren't dead, where would it be going? Would it be going to the Parks Commission or?
It'd go to the park board prior, and then it would come
Okay.
to city council as a land acquisition before
Okay.
anything would be done, but we
Okay.
have not gotten to that stage.
Okay. Okay, moving along, other questions? Councilmember Pelosi.
You know, I think it would be helpful if, now like here, looking at the the budgeted 125,000, it's in my head that it's kind of allocated. It's still in a planning stage.
Well,
Yeah, like
Just-
Bob just said, not obligated or committed yet, so I think we should know that. Put an asterisk or something here, because
Okay.
when I look down at budget, I'm saying that that's money that we can maybe direct other ways.
remember, I'm just to
Yes.
remember, this budget, these numbers were put in almost a year ago.
Okay.
And so a budget's a plan, and we want to plan for what we think is going to happen. And as soon, even before we adopt the budget, at times it's already outdated, things have happened, it's a
Sure.
living, breathing thing. And so, yeah, I
I guess
understand what you're
as-
saying.
I guess as we go through this isn't gonna be any good to us unless we know the specifics that you know that we don't know.
Well, I don't know the specifics, I will need to,
Well, then maybe the directors ought to,
I'll have to get information from them to find
Yeah.
out where we're at, what, if anything's been
but
started
what
or
we're
not.
trying to do is find out where we can get some money to put into the road program.
Okay.
One of the things that I don't understand, and Shelley, I'm sure you can explain it for me, when I look through the REIT 2 list, I see all this maintenance, what in my mind is maintenance. Top dressing sand storage cover structure at the golf course, fairway drainage improvements, all of these, what I see is things that you would do in the normal practice of business. You know, you're going to have to every year upgrade a certain number of your golf holes just to have a competitive golf course. And why isn't that built into their regular operation budget?
Because this city we do not have a capital replacement fund. We have replacement for our rolling stock and equipment rental. We also, in our IT
Okay.
fund, we have equipment replacement for our computers and things. But when you look at entities like Valleycom and SCORE, they have a capital replacement fund. They've got one building, and you can get your arms around it. But we don't have any replacement funds for our general facilities,
Okay.
for our streets, for our curbs, our sidewalks. I could go on.
Yeah. Okay.
And our parks.
Okay.
And to get there, it's very expensive. And this is something that not just this city's struggling with, but every city across this country is struggling with that, how to maintain infrastructure. So that would be another internal service or a sinking fund, a capital fund, where you figure out what you're going to need and you put some money aside for that.
Okay. That helps me understand. Recently, we did a budget amendment where we were looking at painting some major something.
Right.
That helps me greatly understand that. Thank you. Councilmember DeCoursey.
A couple of questions. One is, and Darrell, perhaps this is for you, in looking at the golf course. No replacement reserves, no replacement fund. Is there any opportunity to take some of the revenues that we get off of the greens fees and such to start taking a percentage of that, even on a small basis, and using that as some sort of a reserve fund?
We did have, and Darrell, correct me if I'm wrong here, but we did, back when it was an enterprise fund and it was a standalone, we had, I think, $1 on each round that was to go for the maintenance, but now it's in the general fund, and it's just kind of in the general fund. And what we found is normally these types of things would have been done in the fund, the golf course fund, the enterprise fund, but now it's in the general fund. And you know, we're looking at real estate excise tax to help maintain that park-like facility. And we may have used REIT money in the past when there weren't enough revenues to run the golf course, let alone do the maintenance. And we've done these rebuilds. Sometimes we've used REIT and sometimes they've had money residual, but some of these rebuilds take some years to save up money to do them.
Okay. The other question I had is, you mentioned the City Hall exterior structural repairs. You mentioned the brickwork. What, do we know exactly what needs to be done on the building?
I don't know exactly what needs to be done, but I think it has to do with sealing the building and maybe some.
So can we find that, so is it just a brick seal that we're doing every so often, or is it a pinpointing, or if someone can find out what
I would have
the
to.
extent is, so that would be helpful. Thank you.
Councilmember Pelosi.
I got maybe the detail here. I'd have to search for it, but in this document would have it.
We can do it. We don't need to do it right now if we don't need to.
Yeah,
We
'cause
can-
But I
just-
think
just
it's
information.
sealing and,
With the leaks in the hall, I would guess that it's sealing.
and that's
And
part of the
there's severe
sealing.
settling on one side. Yeah. Councilmember Pelosi.
I'd like to make a suggestion, Shelley.
Yes.
For next time, and that is, like, I'm back on this Mary Olson Farm, 125,000.
Yes.
I think that this budget for 2017, 2018 should be scrubbed. And had I an explanation on 125,000, and probably all of us, and we had a little side note that explained what the director was telling us, that would, I think,
Okay.
solve us. So all of these down here, if we've got money that's potentially there and or not there,
Okay.
if we had a little caveat description.
One of the things that I'm looking at is I'm a little bit more of a generalist, and because I want to rely on the expertise of staff to kind of determine which is a priority and which is not. But I'm really having some concerns about the acquisition of property using REIT 1, and then we spend the rest of our life maintaining it through an ever-growing list of REIT 2. And so I think we need to look philosophically at the concept of, you know, how we are spending some of our money on property acquisition and that type of thing. I also have a question on the item down here, the transfer out, the traffic mitigation fees, about the 12th one down under REIT 2. Tell me a little bit about these traffic mitigation fees.
Traffic mitigation, 12th one?
Traffic impact fees. Excuse me. Thank you.
Oh, traffic impact fees. That is for the downtown area where the city council has exempted the traffic impact fees for the 4 blocks, maybe 5, in the downtown area. So if someone comes in and takes a permit out under that exemption, that traffic impact fee still needs to be paid, and this is the money to pay that impact fee.
So we paid $400,000?
That's what it's estimated to be on the 2 projects.
So we would not actually pay that unless somebody actually pulled a permit.
Who does that go to, Shelley?
That goes over to the mitigation fund. We move it out of our real estate excise tax fund, and we move it over to the traffic impact fee account. And so it's available to do capacity projects in the TIP.
So it's out of one pocket into another?
Yes, that's right.
And
State law.
and you said it goes to what fund?
It goes to the mitigation fund.
Ghost.
And there's several accounts in the mitigation fund, and traffic impact fees is one.
For new roads.
For corridor
Okay.
projects.
For capacity projects that are part of the traffic impact fee list. So when we bring you the traffic impact fee calculations each year, that's based upon a project list. Those impact fees can be used for any of those projects on the list. All of those are in the tip, but it may not be everything that's in the tip.
Councilmember Baggett?
Just to reiterate something that I've stated last meeting, I haven't really heard much from the directors, and I think that we really need to have the directors take a hard look at their budgets. And Councilmember Pelosi mentioned the fact that we need to scrub perhaps some of these budgets. I'd like to really hear from our directors about what they feel that we can actually give up here so we can make this goal that we're trying to reach.
Okay, when we move into that arena,
Yeah.
what the directors have met, and we have come up with some questions for this committee to help us when we go through these budgets and determine what we can or cannot do as far
Yeah,
as.
and with all due respect, we're looking for answers, not more questions. We've already posed the
Okay.
question, so
And
perhaps
with
the
all-
answers.
And with all due respect, back until we have some answers back from this committee, the department directors have gotten together, but we're challenged right now to give you the answers you're looking for because we need some further direction from you. So we actually, as Director Coleman shared, we actually have met and we've been trying to put together responses, but we're kind of stuck, if you will. And so we wanted to spend some time with you, and we've actually prepared a series of questions. If the proverbial, help us so we can help you, so to speak, we need some help in getting some direction from you so that we can narrow down the focus, because your questions are somewhat broad, and we could come back with a lot of information, and we might spend a lot of your valuable time going over information that may not be necessary. So we're obviously gonna run out of time, but what we'd like to do tonight is at least provide you with the questions, so that you can take some time, and in our next meeting, we'd like to spend some of your next meeting agenda, go over these with you, because once we do that, Councilmember, I think that we're in a better position to help give you the information that you're requesting. But we're struggling a little bit right now, and we're just being honest. As the directors, we got together and we talked about this, but the reality is we need some more direction. So.
Well, it's a difficult thing to do. I mean, I realize that. I mean, you've got goals, you've got things that you need to have done out there or feel you need to have done for our city, and that's all admirable. But when the rubber meets the road, pardon my, pun, but basically we need to come up with this money, and it's going to be hard pressed. We need to try to squeeze wherever we can, and it needs to be recurring. It's not just a one-time shot.
And that's part of the questions that we want to go over with you, is to delineate between what your short-term and or long-term goals may be. So I have a memo that I'd like to at least hand out to you this evening.
Love it.
Again, we're probably out of time to go into any substantive detail, but if we could reserve some time on your next meeting agenda to go
We'll
over.
start with that, if you don't
think
mind, but
that would be great.
I have one quick question. I was led to believe that when we developed this budget, the department chair people came together and did a really good job of kind of prioritizing, the direction that we needed to have. Then Shelley came up with the numbers, and you kept working it, and you presented it to us. How could something come to us where there was give and take between the various directors where there's a $5 million deficit?
Well, let me back up. So the first answer is yes, we had a very collaborative process.
Yeah.
The directors and the mayor, utilizing information put
Yeah.
together by Director Coleman, met. We looked at the different priorities. I would delineate a little bit, Deputy Mayor, between the operational element of the budgets versus what the finance director is talking in terms of the capital side, because really what you're talking about with street preservation is you're talking about an ongoing capital program. This is not, it's different than a biennial budget cycle, theoretically at least, and this is Kevin speaking from Kevin's perspective, and you've used the term, you should be doing a sustainable program that really never ends, quite honestly. And whether it's $5 million or it's $1 million, whatever the number is now, it should be an ongoing program. That difference, if you will, that's a number that has not changed over the years, so to speak, because there's been a lot of conversations in the past. For example, previous Mayor Lewis had an arterial streets task force that talked about the needs of the city relative to arterial streets and the funding challenges. And he had an outside committee work with that and bring that information to council.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, this is a need that has never been funded, and we've been working at it over the last 15, 20 years. And we did have the commission, as Kevin was talking about, that met, and their recommendation was to take the 1% on the utility taxes and put it towards this arterial street preservation. It's not enough. The TBD is a tool that the state legislature developed about 6, 7, 8 years ago for our cities. They want us to be responsible for our own needs, and these tools, they want us to use these tools to maintain our streets with.
We also asked you.
We also asked you last time to give us an idea of what 0.5% increase in the, and so can I assume that a 0.5% increase would generate about $1 million? If currently we have 1% utility tax and it generates $2 million?
No,
Okay.
because the utility tax that is going in there is not, that's a 0.5% in our water, sewer, storm, and refuse fund, and it's $300,000 for 0.5%. But what we have going into those, the other utilities, gas, power, telephone,
Okay.
cable.
Okay. If you could bring that for us next time, or it's
It-
probably in here someplace, but
it
I
is.
couldn't find it.
It is.
Okay.
Deputy Mayor, just one
Yes.
additional point to what you said. So as long as I've been affiliated with the city, the issue of a gap in funding for streets
Yeah.
has been on the table. City Engineer Galb, in our conversations, she's been affiliated with the city for over 20 years. It's been a conversation piece during her lifetime with the city. I think the challenge is that obviously, and you're seeing it across the region, with the amount of growth and the amount of traffic coming with that growth and the impact of the street systems, it has probably become more focused
Apparent, yeah.
and more apparent than any other time in recent history. So, it's sometimes not good to be in pleasant company. All the cities around us, in various forms or fashions, are having the same conversations that you are.
Yeah. Our next meeting, thank you for the questions. That'll give us some time to study them, and our next meeting will be on the 15th at 6 o'clock. And with that, oh, yes, Shelley.
Okay, just to recap real quickly here, what you're looking for is you're looking for the status of all the budgeted REAP money in the 17 and 18 budget from the directors.
I'd just like you to find the $5 million.
Anything else I can come up with.
Okay, and then we still have more project lists that we didn't make it to.
Okay, great,
Okay.
great. But I really appreciate that you're spending this time to kind of bring us along.
Okay.
Even though we've heard it many times, we're getting a total picture now that's really very helpful. And I appreciate yours and Ingrid's and Kevin's patience. Thank you.
You're welcome.